Old Jacob Weller had exactly one thing of value left in the world, a single brown dairy cow named Bess. She was the last living thing on his failing farm, the one source of milk and butter and the little income that kept him alive. And on a hot, dusty evening in the middle of the worst summer anyone could remember, Jacob gave her away to a family of strangers, and the whole town of Cedar Ridge called him a fool for it. Times were hard that year. A long drought had scorched the land, crops had failed all across the county, and money was scarce as rain. Jacob himself was barely holding on. He was in his early 60s then, a widower whose wife had passed some years before, working a small, dry farm that had never been much to begin with and was now less than that. Most of his animals were gone, sold off or lost to the hard times. All he had left was old Bess, and the milk she gave him each morning was, quite literally, the difference between getting by and going under. It was on that dusty evening that the family came walking up the road. Jacob saw them from his porch, a young man and woman and two small children, all of them thin as rails and gray with road dust, carrying everything they owned in a couple of worn bundles. They were the kind of family the hard times had made common that year, folks who'd lost their farm or their work, put out on the road with nowhere to go, drifting from town to town, looking for anything at all. The young father stopped at Jacob's gate, took off his hat, and in a voice worn down to almost nothing, asked if the old farmer might spare a bit of food. They hadn't eaten, he said, in nearly 2 days, and it was the children he was worried about. Jacob looked at those two little ones, hollow-cheeked and silent in the way that only truly hungry children are silent, and his old heart broke clean in two. He brought the family up to his porch and gave them what he had, which wasn't much, some bread and the last of his salt pork, and fresh milk from Bess for the children. He watched them eat like they hadn't eaten in a week, which they very nearly hadn't, and as they ate, he learned their story. The young father, whose name was Thomas, had lost their small farm to the bank that spring. They'd been walking ever since, heading west, chasing a rumor of work in another state, hundreds of miles away. But the children were failing on the journey. They were sick from hunger, weak, falling behind. Thomas confessed, his voice breaking, that he was terrified they wouldn't make it, that he was watching his family starve on the road and could do nothing to stop it. Jacob sat with them a long while as the sun went down, and an idea took hold of him. A foolish idea, he knew, an impossible idea, but he couldn't shake it. The next morning, before the family set off again, Jacob walked out to the barn, and he came back leading Bess by her rope. He handed that rope to the young father. "Take her," Jacob said. "Sir?" "Take the cow," Jacob said again. "She's a good milker, steady. That milk'll keep those little ones alive on the road, and there'll be enough to sell a bit besides, for whatever else you need. She'll get your family where you're going." He pressed the rope into the young man's hands. Thomas was overwhelmed and then horrified as he understood what the old man was offering. "I can't," he stammered. "Sir, I can't take your cow. Anyone can see she's all you've got. This is your whole living. I can't take the last thing you have." "That's exactly why you can take it," Jacob said gently. "Son, I'm an old man alone on a dying farm. If I go under, I go under alone, and I've had my life. But you've got 2 babies who won't survive the road without her. There's no question here. There's no choice. A man doesn't keep his last cow while children starve in front of him. He just doesn't. Now take her and go, and don't you ever look back, and don't you ever feel guilty about it. Not for one day. You hear me?" The young father wept openly then, and so did his wife, and Jacob had to practically push them out the gate to get them to go. But go they did, leading old Bess down the dusty road toward a far-off hope, while the old farmer stood at his gate and watched until they disappeared over the hill. And then Jacob turned and walked back into his empty barn, to his empty farm, having given away the very last thing that kept him alive. The people of Cedar Ridge couldn't believe it when they heard it. Jacob Weller gave his last cow to a family of drifters, they said, shaking their heads. Strangers he'll never see again. The old fool's gone and doomed himself. He'll starve now, sure as anything. And they weren't entirely wrong. That winter was the hardest of Jacob's life. Without Bess, he had almost nothing, and he scraped through on the charity of a few kind neighbors and sheer stubbornness. More than once, he nearly lost the farm altogether, but somehow he held on. And whenever anyone told him he'd been a fool to give away the cow, Jacob would only shake his head and say, "I'd do it again tomorrow. A man's got to live with himself, and I couldn't have lived with letting those children starve. The cow was just a cow, but those were somebody's babies." The years passed and turned into decades. Jacob never heard a word from the family. He didn't expect to. They'd been heading hundreds of miles away, into lives he'd never know. He often wondered whether they'd made it, whether the children had survived, whether old Bess had gotten them where they were going, but he never learned. The family passed into memory, just one more chapter in the long story of an old farmer's hard and quiet life. Jacob grew older and older still, until he was well into his 90s, impossibly ancient, frail and poorer than ever, living out his final years alone on the same small, failing farm, cared for now and then by the neighbors who'd known him all their lives. And then one spring morning, 30 years after that dusty evening, the road to Jacob's farm filled with the sound of engines. The old man made his slow way to the porch and looked out in astonishment. Coming up his long dirt lane was a whole line of vehicles, fine trucks and construction equipment, and a gleaming car at the front of it all. They pulled up before his farmhouse, and a well-dressed man in his 40s climbed out of the car and walked toward the porch. Jacob had never seen him before in his life, but his eyes were full of tears as he looked up at the frail old farmer. "You won't remember me," he said, his voice trembling. "I was only 6 years old, but 30 years ago, on this very porch, you gave my family your last cow, and you saved all of our lives." Jacob's breath caught. The children, one of the 2 hungry children from all those years ago, grown now into a man. The man, his name was Samuel, told Jacob everything. That cow, old Bess, had indeed carried them through. Her milk had kept the children alive through the long journey west, and when they'd finally reached their destination, Bess had become the very foundation of their new beginning. Thomas had used her to start over, a little milk to sell, then a second cow, then a small dairy. Slowly, over the years, through hard work and the head start that one gift had given them, that desperate, starving family had built something, a dairy farm, then a bigger one, then a business that grew and grew across an entire generation until the children of that starving family had become successful beyond anything they could have dreamed of on that dusty road. "My father never stopped talking about you," Samuel said, weeping now, "not for one single day of his life. He said you were the finest man he ever met. He said an old farmer who had nothing gave us everything and asked for nothing back, and that we were to spend our whole lives being worthy of it. He tried to find you years ago to thank you, but he only ever knew you as the old farmer in Cedar Ridge, and he couldn't track you down before he passed." Samuel wiped his eyes. "But I never forgot, and when my father died last year, I made him a promise at his grave. I promised I would find the old man who saved us, if he was still alive, and I would repay a debt that can never be truly repaid." Jacob was overwhelmed, hardly able to speak, But Samuel wasn't finished. He gestured to the trucks and the equipment filling the old farmer's lane. He had already arranged everything. He was going to rebuild Jacob's entire farm, every fence, every field, the barn, the house, all of it, better than it had ever been. He was paying off every debt against the land. He was setting up a fund to care for Jacob in comfort and dignity for the rest of his days. And he was filling the old man's empty barn with livestock, a whole herd of fine dairy cattle, dozens of them, so that the farm that gave away its last cow would never want for anything again. "I'm not doing this out of charity," Samuel said, taking the old man's frail hands. "I'm doing it because 30 years ago you taught my whole family the most important thing we ever learned. You taught us that you give when someone's in need, not when it's easy, not when you can spare it, but especially when you can't. You gave us your last cow when you had nothing, and now I've come to give you back a herd when I have everything. That's not charity, Jacob. That's just the harvest